So I am really pleased to be here today with the lovely Rachel Barratt from HR Elite. Good afternoon to you, Rachel.
Afternoon, Sam.
So Rachel has been a tremendous support to a number of my clients throughout the last 10 days, really helping them and guiding them and supporting them through all the different conundrums and options that we face as business owners and responsibilities that we have towards our team right now, especially with the introduction of the job retention scheme. So I asked Rachel if she wouldn't mind coming on today, recording some Q&As with me and just really sharing the expertise that I know that she's been supporting, as I say, a huge number of my clients with. So first of all, thank you, Rachel, for all the help and support you've given them. I know you've been invaluable and the feedback that I've had has been absolutely amazing. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
It's really critical at the moment to get the right level of help, isn't it? The support in terms of, we can all interpret things differently. So to have an expert, especially in HR, to give us real, clear, concise direction on what the law means, what the legislation means, and what we can and can't do. I mean, I think everybody will really see the value in that.
Definitely. We've had a number of our clients and also them talking to business owners themselves coming to us and asking us questions. And then when we actually get into the detail, they've said to us how they haven't fully understood exactly what particularly around the job retention scheme, because there is a lot of uncertainty around it, what it actually means in detail. So we've obviously spent an awful lot of time researching, learning, looking at the government guidelines, speaking with people within our HR network to really try and understand the legislation that's coming about and that is so new to us all as a result of the coronavirus. So it is really, really important to try and get that expert help so that you're actually making the right decisions and making sure that you're making them in line with employment legislation still.
Yeah, and I think in terms of so much uncertainty and so much fear and anxiety and unknown out there right now, it's like I say, it's critical to get that real detailed expert help. So I know people really value, the effort that you're putting into helping them and supporting them through this. So what is the biggest help and support you have been to business owners over the last 2 weeks?
I think the biggest question that has come up over the last few days is around the job retention scheme grant and where it will be available and where it may not be. When the Chancellor announced that they were making the grant available and that they would be paying 80% of staff's wages who were placed at home or off work, which they're calling furlough, which is a completely new term in this country. It's actually an American term. So they've introduced that term over here very quickly, obviously for the purpose of laying people off, but then allowing those staff to receive 80% of their salary, which is the coronavirus job retention scheme. At the time the Chancellor announced it, I think everybody got quite, I wouldn't say excited is the right word, because nobody wants to be put off on 80% of their salary. Ultimately, they'd want to be earning their full salary, but probably relief is the right word. Obviously, staff are worried about coming into work. We've been told that we should stay at home where we can. Now having to be off of work in some situations, those individuals are aware that they could receive 80% of their salaries, and employers were probably, again, sighing a big sigh of relief because they know that 80% will be covered. Then I think reality sunk in a bit a few days later, and we were being asked questions. Is this just too good to be real, really? Too good to be true? When are they going to pay out, and when may they not pay out? Obviously, if you furlough a member of staff, and at the moment they haven't got the system set up, they're intending to do that by the end of April. So staff are already being furloughed, but questions are now being asked as to whether the grant will actually be paid out under certain circumstances or not. So that's the biggest question that we're getting coming through at the moment.
And that's not a surprise, because when it first came out, you're right, everybody thought that they had a given right to this grant and that there was no exclusions and no criteria. And we're yet to find out what the criteria really is, aren't we?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's some really obvious cases where the grant will be paid out. The government guidelines actually say that the job retention scheme grant will be available where a company or a business has been severely affected by the virus. Right. That's really the only terminology we've got to understand where it will be paid out, but that's still quite a vague statement. There are obviously companies who have been massively affected by the coronavirus. They've either had a huge downturn in work, there might be certain areas of work where sites have shut down and those individuals just simply cannot perform those duties or that piece of work. There are also some really serious financial consequences for certain businesses as a result of the coronavirus. So I think under those circumstances, that's when it's quite clear cut that the job retention scheme will pay out the 80% grant. There's obviously a lot of companies who have still got work that can be performed and are still providing those services. I'm not so certain, and this is where the hazy part comes in, I'm not so certain the government are going to be freely giving away 80% of staff salaries if they could actually be in work and still be earning money, but the company has still got work to perform and is still receiving funds for those particular services. And that's where, for HR Elite's clients, we're asking those companies if they can hold fire on furloughing staff until payments are actually being made through the coronavirus job retention scheme, and we can actually start to learn at that point under what circumstances the grant will be paid out or may not be paid out in certain situations. That's easy for me to say. Some companies might not be able to wait until the end of April. Whilst the grant is going to be available for some companies, payments may still need to be made at the end of April in terms of people's salaries. The government have said that they will be making payments at the end of April, but until we actually receive that money in the bank, you know, we need to really be prepared to the fact that we might still have to pay those wages and then have that money come back to us maybe a week or two later. Yeah. So that's a reality for a lot of companies.
So would your advice be then to those companies to furlough people, but with the understanding that, you know, they need to be able to cash flow this if they don't get the grant at the end of April?
It's a risk they're going to have to take. As I say, there are some situations and companies have already furloughed staff where absolutely they will be entitled to the grant. Yeah. For companies where there isn't that clarity, and as I say, it is still a little bit hazy, it's absolutely at their risk whether they want to do that. I would say that if they are taking a risk, there is the potential that they may have to pay those salaries themselves. So if they feel that they're taking a calculated risk, then that might be okay for them. If they haven't got the money, if for example, the grant wasn't paid out, and they haven't got the money to pay the salaries, the staff are still entitled to payment, and it would be full pay because in effect the company has asked them to go home, and they are still entitled to their wages. And that's why companies do need to be really, really careful and really quite certain if they are furloughing staff that they would be entitled to that grant.
Yeah, and this is why getting the right help is so important, isn't it? The right advice, because we could find ourselves in these situations not knowing that we're still liable for that payroll. So
yeah, absolutely.
The question that I've been asked recently by clients is, what would happen if work levels increased and I let people that are currently furloughed come back to work, but then it was only a short-term project and I had to furlough them again? Is that allowed?
Yes, it is. The conditions of receiving the grant. So we need to understand there's a difference between being furloughed but receiving the coronavirus job retention scheme grant. So the word furlough is in relation to laying people off.
Right.
The grant will only be paid out if the conditions of the furlough apply. And this is where we come back to that statement in the government guidelines about whether the company has been severely affected by the coronavirus. So furloughing staff is an act of putting them off on unpaid leave, laying them off, whatever term you want to use. the company then needs to receive the grant to make the payment. So they need to be confident that they are going to get that payment to cover those staff's wages. And that's what I'm saying. If they don't, then they will have to cover those costs themselves.
Okay.
In terms of bringing staff backwards and forwards, you can furlough a member of staff more than once. It's really the stipulations around the grant that control whether companies are going to have people off on furlough and how often they're going to bring them backwards and forwards. The grant will only be payable to furloughed staff where they have been off for a minimum of 3 weeks. Okay. And this is where I'm saying you need to understand the two different terms. So, you can furlough a member of staff, but to actually receive the grant, that individual needs to have been off for at least 3 weeks. They have to remain available to come back to work when the employer needs them. So you can then bring them back to work. And then if they fulfilled the project, then they can be furloughed again. And then again, to receive the grant, they have to remain off for at least 3 weeks. The other important point to just mention is that you can only apply for the grant every 3 weeks. So you can furlough a group of people. Let's say you furloughed 5 people and then you submitted their information to HMRC. You can't then submit another group. So if you were to furlough another group, you can't then submit their information until 3 weeks later. So these 3 weeks time periods are really, really important in terms of being able to receive the grant to cover the 80% cost.
Right, that's useful to know. So it's all about timing as well, getting it at the right time.
Yeah, okay. Definitely.
And what about people that are saying, I've had some scenarios, mainly in construction, I have to say, where they've said that some of my employees have said that they don't want to go to work because there's a lot of pressure from family members to say you need to stay at home. There's a lot of media pressure saying we should be staying at home. So some of them are saying, actually, I don't want to go to work. I want you to furlough me.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a misunderstanding from the general public and people who are working that they think that furlough is a kind of a default option for employers now, and it certainly isn't. So I do think that there is this misunderstanding that staff feel that they can ask to be furloughed, and because it's going to be at no extra cost to the employer, they'll just do that. Yeah. That brings us back to the first point we were discussing about we're not sure yet when the grant will, or what the grant will be paid out for, under what circumstances. So if a member of staff, if the employer hasn't furloughed the individual, but that individual doesn't want to come to work because they're worried about contracting the virus, for example, then the employer has got every right to say that they will either have to take unpaid leave or a period of annual leave, if that's enough to cover the time that they need to be off for. But even unpaid leave isn't a given right to employees. We have actually had a couple of clients who can't even allow their staff to take unpaid leave because they need that amount of people in work to be able to deliver the service. Yeah. So I do think that employees need to understand that furlough isn't a given right to everybody. If they really are too scared to come into work and their employer's agreeable to it, they could potentially take a period of unpaid leave or possibly annual leave. But ultimately, they are under a contract of employment. It's a legal arrangement, and they are employed to work certain days, certain hours of the day, and therefore their employer could expect them to come into work where there is work and money available to pay them to do that work.
Good. That's really helpful to understand that. And what about another question that I've been asked is, if somebody is on maternity leave, can they be furloughed?
This is a really interesting one, and it's always a challenge discussing a lady who might be off on maternity leave. For somebody who is off on maternity leave, they're probably only going to be getting the statutory maternity pay, which is around about £148 a week, I think, at the moment. That's obviously a lot less than what most ladies who are on maternity leave would be getting, even on 80% of their salary. Yeah. The usual terms apply in relation to a lady who's on maternity leave wanting to return to work. They would have to give the reasonable notice, or the amount of notice they're required to do anyway. A lot of the time before a lady goes off on maternity leave, she would have agreed her return date at that stage. So it would probably be quite difficult for somebody who maybe had another 3 months of maternity leave and statutory maternity pay to then ask to come back and then be furloughed, because it's quite evident that they're only doing it to receive the money. That's not to say they couldn't do that, but as a bare minimum, they would have to give the notice required under normal maternity leave returners, unless the employer is happy to have them back more quickly. And then if that employer has already furloughed maybe that department or that group of staff, for example, that maternity leaver falls within, then they could be furloughed and receive the 80%.
Right, okay, right. So again, it's all about timing, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And this is where you can see that there's a lot of detail there, and it can get quite complex in places to make sure that employers are still following legislation.
Sure.
We kind of feel that, especially when we first started hearing that we all need to remain at home, that most companies felt that employment law would be relaxed, but it isn't being at all. In fact, we're being given more legislation that we need to quickly learn and work with, rather than them relaxing the existing laws. And that's why it's so important, obviously, to get the right advice, to make sure you're doing the right things. The last thing an employer needs is to come through this situation, the challenges that we're all facing, and then find that they're being taken to employment tribunals where they have done something incorrect, and then they're losing, having to pay out compensation, and the nightmare continues, basically. So I just advise that really read the detail and make sure you get the correct advice where you can.
Absolutely, because it's quite complex in certain scenarios, isn't it? And there is it feels like there's quite a lot of room for error. So again, I completely endorse that. We need to make sure we protect ourselves and give ourselves the strongest position we can when we come out of lockdown.
Definitely. And talking about coming out of lockdown raises a really important point, which may have been one of your questions. It's about what employers are going to do when we can start going back to work. And it's a really sad situation, and I'm just going to be completely honest. There is going to be, clearly, for a number of employers, a period of recovery, whether that be because they've suffered financial losses, and they need to gradually start building that back, or it might be that they had certain contracts before the coronavirus hit and they've been lost, and they've got to rebuild those contracts, get the work flowing back in. I think there is an assumption that one day everything's going to suddenly go back to normal in terms of people returning to work. I cannot believe that is going to be the case for a lot of employers. In fact, I think most employers are going to have to look at returning people on a more gradual process. If the coronavirus job retention scheme isn't available then the only options that will be available, if employers can't bring everybody back to their usual jobs, working full-time, paying them their usual salaries, is to look at some of the options we were considering before the job retention scheme became available. And that would be looking at a period of unpaid leave, maybe enforcing short-term layoffs where the contract allows for it. So that's really important. Short-term layoffs, it has to be written in the contract of employment. It may be that some staff may be asked to work part-time because a company can only afford those hours, or they may only have half the work available to do. It might be that annual leave is still available for individuals and they take a period of annual leave. Worst case scenario is that some staff may have to be made redundant, and then we're going to be looking at redundancy processes, selecting the right people for redundancy, identifying the correct redundancy pool. And I know that's a really sad message to deliver, but I think we need to be realistic that there, as I say, there's going to be a period of recovery in many different ways, and I don't think most employers will be able to have their whole workforce coming back to work and replacing what was there before the virus hit. So some really tough decisions to be made there.
And I know I'm already getting word from my clients that when we do return back to some sort of normality, they're unlikely to let everybody return at the same time, because they're going to have to phase people in. I mean, if you're in a production, then obviously you're going to want your production people back first before you've got your warehouse people and your packing people. So it absolutely makes sense that we're going to need to stagger the return of our workforce. And also, I really do think that this is going to teach us new ways of doing business, and it could make a lot of businesses more efficient. And there may just be that they're finding through new technologies and having the time to explore new avenues like technology, that actually they don't need as many heads returning as what they did before. So that's a real scenario that could happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, home working is obviously a huge working practice that has come out of this coronavirus. Yeah. It was obviously already there. There is legislation in place where staff can request to work flexibly, and home working would be a flexible working arrangement. A lot of employers didn't believe in it or felt that it wouldn't be good for business. They've been forced to do that now, and obviously there's a period of adjustment, but I actually, the people that I've spoken to, the majority of them are saying how much home working is actually working for them. So I do think that, you know, I think we're hearing everywhere, aren't we, that actually this is going to change how we do things in the workplace, and I can absolutely see that happening. So definitely companies will be looking at different ways of working, and that may result in less staff, less resources, and therefore that's where unfortunately some redundancies are probably going to come into play here.
So you feel that actually you're going to get busier in terms of your HR support when we do return back from lockdown, because you're going to be needed for, you know, maybe some more recovery challenges and solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. There's very, very strict laws around making somebody redundant. And again, as I said earlier, we don't want companies falling foul and finding themselves in an employment tribunal. No. If companies do have to make staff redundant, they really should take advice, because, as I say, there's a lot of legislation around making an individual redundant, and that absolutely has to be followed.
Yeah. I've had a message actually while we've been talking, a question for you. Can you make somebody redundant whilst they're on furlough?
So a lot of people have probably heard, and it is in the guidelines, that for anybody who was made redundant after the 28th of February, before the job retention scheme was announced, can be brought back off of redundancy, but it has to be agreed. First of all, the employer has to want that, and secondly, the individual has to agree to that. So that is a possibility. In terms of making somebody redundant whilst they're already on furlough, there's a number of points to consider. When you are making somebody redundant, before you actually follow through with that process, you have to know whether there is actually a redundancy situation there in the first place. I think it would be arguable that whilst the furlough and the job retention scheme is available, that there is an alternative to redundancy at the moment. So employers need to seriously think about that. We have had a number of clients saying to us, I want to make a couple of people redundant. And we've said, well, why would you do that? The coronavirus job retention scheme is available. If you're having to make people redundant because you haven't got the money or the work available, yeah, clearly you would be eligible for the grant. Why don't you put these individuals on furlough? They get the benefit of the 80%, and then you can look at making them redundant afterwards. So that's what we would be challenging with our clients, and what we have been challenging with our clients.
Right.
I do think as we approach the return, and if furlough and the job retention scheme grant is still available then, because they have said they may extend it beyond the 31st of May, it's then about companies preparing for the return. So I think it is probably okay at that point to start looking where there is a business requirement to do it, because obviously they've taken a hit in terms of finances or workload. At that point is probably the right time to start looking at redundancies, and we may still have people off on furlough at that point, as I say, especially if the government extends the job retention scheme grant beyond the 31st of May.
Right, that makes complete sense. Okay. So, Rachel, I really do value the time that you've given us today. You've been a tremendous help, as I say, to so many already, and we're so grateful for you for that. So what is the biggest tip or advice that you would give somebody right now, do you think, who owns a business and has a team?
I think the biggest tip we're giving companies at the moment is to look at your HR strategy. You need to look at your workforce. We are dealing with the unknown. We don't know what's happening from day to day at the moment. At the moment, I think companies need to look at the resources they've got, the work they've got available, and the money they've got coming into the business, and really plan those resources around that. That will then identify if they should be furloughing certain individuals. We've then got the return, and that's really hard to predict at the moment and makes it very difficult to plan for that. But I suggest and I advise that when you start getting more information, if you do start taking on more jobs, to really look again at what resources you need then. Making decisions about making people redundant and the costs involved in that as well are substantial, and as I say, really tough decisions. So the more thought you can give it, the better, and then you'll be making the right decisions for the future of the business, but also making it hopefully an easier process for the individuals involved.
Great, that's great. And we were talking this morning, Rachel, weren't we, on our mastermind group about the moral stance sometimes. I mean, we had members of our mastermind that were saying, look, my company has not yet been hit. I could furlough staff, but I don't morally feel like that's right. What do you say to people in that situation?
It's a really, really tough decision. We've had a number of companies who have got plenty of work available. Some have actually even benefited. We have a number of clients who provide services for Amazon, for example, and they're busier than they've ever been. So they need their staff. They absolutely need their staff. They need their staff to work more hours than what they were doing before. But there is this moral obligation. We're all human, you know, we're all worried. We're all in this situation together. And I think most people would be understanding that a number of people don't feel comfortable coming into work. However, you know, as I say, if the work is there, then it has to be done. As long as the companies are making sure they're following the guidelines about social distancing, that they have the right health and safety measures in place, then hopefully staff will feel more comfortable coming into work and fulfilling their work obligations. Yeah. But I think we'd all be silly to say that it's you know, it is a very, very tough decision, and as human beings we all struggle with the fact that, you know, for some of us we can sit at home and we can do our work from our home offices, just as I'm doing. It's easy for me to say if there's work available, then staff have to go in, because I can sit at home and I can work from home. So it's a tough one really, but unfortunately we have to do what we have to do sometimes, and businesses are having to make sure that they are going to be viable over the coming months. They need to make sure they're there when things do start going back to normal, and it's about keeping people's jobs. Yeah. If they allowed everyone to sit at home, they're going to lose their business, and then those staff won't have a job to come back to. So there are some very good reasons as well for asking the staff to come in, even though we're going through a really challenging time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what is really encouraging as well, though, we're talking a lot about, you know, the redundancies and, you know, making people take salary cuts and reduced hours and things like that. But just to end on a positive note, again, going back to our call this morning on Mastermind, there are so many good opportunities out there for businesses at the moment, and there are some real success stories as well. You know, it's amazing to see actually the opportunities that are coming out in this, but that's not for everybody, and we have to obviously adapt to our own situation. And if we need HR help, we need to get the right advice, and that is so critical for reasons we said earlier. So Rachel, if anyone's watching this and they want your services, they want to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
There's two ways. They can either email us at info@hrelite.co.uk, or they can call us on our landline, which is 01206 700 690. We have a number of HR consultants working at HR Elite. One of us will be there to take your calls. We've obviously been extremely busy over the last few weeks, but we are absolutely there to support anybody who needs our help.
That's amazing. Thank you. And thanks again. I know you're so busy, but thanks for giving me that time today. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for what you're doing.
No problem at all.
Speak to you soon.
Speak to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.